Welcome to the Original Self Podcast. I'm Yvette Dakota, owner of Dakota Life Coaching and a psychology-informed life coach exploring resilience, mindset, and the courage to become your authentic self. This is a space for honest conversations about growth, identity, relationships, and all the messy moments in between that shape who we become. Between the salon chair and coaching sessions, I've watched people move through life in patterns they rarely notice. Patterns that are subtle or familiar and incredibly hard to see from the inside. Today's episode begins with a simple question. How much time do you spend thinking about food? Most of us have never stopped to consider that answer. Today, I want to explore why that question matters and what does it reveal about the way food has come to occupy our attention. This is episode 17, Food Noise, Why You Can't Stop Thinking About Food. Hello and welcome back. In the last episode, we explored how hyper-palatable foods are engineered to capture our attention and keep us coming back for more. We discussed how the combination of sugar, fat, salt, flavor enhancers, and food technology can override the body's natural systems of hunger and fullness. More importantly, we discuss the possibility that many of the struggles that people experience around food are not evidence of weakness, but predictable responses to an environment designed to encourage consumption. At the end of that episode, I mentioned the term food noise. Over the last few years, the term has become increasingly common in conversations surrounding GLP-1 medications like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Zepbound. People have described an unexpected experience when they first start these medications. And the headlines focus on the weight loss, which is completely true. They do help you lose weight. But many users described a quieting of the constant mental chatter around food in their minds. So what fascinated me was not just the medication, but the language people were using. Again and again, I read and heard people who had never met one another describe the same experience. They talked about food taking up less space in their mind. They described feeling relief. And some realized for the first time that not everyone spends as much time thinking about food as they do. The one I liked the most, I read this, described it as though a radio that had been playing in their heads for decades had suddenly had the volume turned down. My own experience is finally being able to stop thinking about the 4 pieces of pizza that were still left in the box simply because I wasn't hungry anymore. And then my brain just didn't think about it anymore. And listening and experiencing those stories really made me think, how much time do we actually spend thinking about food? I think most of us have never stopped to measure it. We simply assume it's normal. And that raises an interesting psychological question. If millions of people are suddenly discovering that food can occupy less mental space than they thought possible, what exactly was occupying the space in the first place? What is food noise? Where did it come from? And then why do some people experience it more intensely than others? Because I know that I really experienced it. most of the time for a good portion of my life. And perhaps it's super important to think about, what if this constant preoccupation with food is not simply an individual problem to solve, but a predictable response to the world we live in? So before we talk about where food noise comes from, we need to understand what it actually is. Because food noise is not the same thing as hunger. I think understanding the distinction may be a very important part of this conversation. Hunger is a biological signal, right? It's your body's way of communicating that it needs energy. Hunger obviously builds gradually over time. And for most of human history, it served a completely practical purpose. It motivated us to seek food, eat enough to survive, and then move on with our lives, move on with our day. Food noise is something different. It's a mental preoccupation with food that exists whether you're physically hungry or not. It's a running commentary in the background of your day, that constant awareness of food, the planning of it, the bargaining with it, the anticipation, the cravings, and sometimes, if you're me, most of the time, it's the guilt that accompanies thinking about food. For some, food noise shows up as thinking about lunch while you're still eating breakfast. Or for others, it appears as a promise that tomorrow is going to be different. You're going to be good, in quotations. It can also look like scrolling through recipes, despite having no intention to cook them. Or like when I used to watch the Food Network on most days, I thought that I was absorbing chef skills when in reality, I was only indulging my food noise. Another aspect of food noise is wandering into the kitchen when you're not hungry, or feeling distracted by thoughts of food when your attention has to be somewhere else. What's interesting is that many people who experience food noise don't necessarily expect it to ever disappear. It's just part of their daily life. That's why so many people were surprised when that noise quieted. For the first time, we felt a different relationship with food. And that's when we realized that the noise wasn't as inevitable as we had once believed. Psychologists have long understood that our attention is influenced by more than biological need, because humans are highly responsive to the cues in their environment. Psychologists have long understood that our attention is influenced by more than biological needs, because we're responsive to the cues in our environment. We notice things that are associated with reward and pleasure, comfort, and basically survival. For example, people can walk past a bakery and they may suddenly think of an almond croissant, despite having eaten an hour ago. Or some people watching television may find themselves craving a product they had no interest in before the commercial appeared. Think about the millions of dollars advertisers spend on the Super Bowl alone. Commercials about McDonald's, Domino's, Snicker bars, and how DoorDash can deliver it to your door in under 30 minutes. The industry knows the power of how attention, memory, emotions, and reward interact. Food is uniquely powerful because it sits at the intersection of biology and psychology. We need it to survive. That's the biological part. but we also attach meaning to it. And then over time, our brains become very efficient to linking food to emotional experiences. The result is food begins to occupy mental territory, extending far beyond simple nourishment. Researchers have increasingly recognized that food noise appears to operate primarily in the hedonic hunger system. Remember, that's not, I'm super hungry and I need to survive. That's the pleasure reward part of hunger. This system cares less about the body's need for calories and nutrition and more about the brain's anticipation of a rewarding experience. That distinction completely matters because it shifts the conversation away from the idea that people only eat because they're hungry. The more we learn about eating behavior, the more difficult it becomes to reduce it to a simple matter of choice. It develops within a culture where food is always available. It's relentlessly advertised. And it's constantly competing for our attention. Every day, we are surrounded by cues designed to keep food on our minds, whether we're hungry or not. Yet, despite all that complexity, many people still treat food noise as a personal failing. They assume that it's their preoccupation with food, and they're flawed. I did. But perhaps another question is, if so many people experience food noise, why are we treating it as an individual problem? What if it isn't a reflection of personal weakness or poor choices? Again, what if it's a predictable response to the environment we've created around food? To answer those questions, we need to look at how food became more than food and how an entire industry learned to compete for one of the most valuable resources we have, our attention. Okay, so if food noise is partly a product of the environment around us, then it's worth asking, how did the environment come to be? Most of us think of food as something simple. Food is nourishment. Food is fuel. Food is pleasure. We assume that food companies are primarily in the business of selling products people want to eat, right? But over the last several decades, something changed. Beginning in the 1980s, tobacco companies began purchasing food companies. Philip Morris acquired General Foods and later on Kraft, while R.J. Reynolds acquired Nabisco. But these were not random acquisitions. These were humongous industries in tobacco, in cigarettes. And then they purchased food companies. Their goal was not only to sell food, but to sell products people would continue to buy. The tobacco industry had already invested enormous resources in understanding what captured attention, what created desire, what encouraged repeat behavior. Those same principles proved incredibly valuable in the food industry. If this sounds familiar, it's because we touched on it last episode when we discussed hyperpalatable foods, how they override the body's natural signals of hunger and fullness, like I said in the beginning. But what these companies understood was that attention drives behavior. They work with lots of psychologists, lots of money spent in R&D. The longer a product, they found this, the longer a product occupies space in your mind, the more likely you are to buy it. The more often you buy it, the more profitable their product becomes, right? It's Econ 101. food companies weren't just competing for shelf space, they were competing for space in your mind. For most of human history, obtaining food required great effort. You had to grow it or hunt it. You had to gather it, preserve it, prepare it. It demanded time and energy. But the flip side of that today, resisting food often requires effort. Isn't that a remarkable shift? That's crazy. Think about how food appears in modern life. It's on television, social media, billboards. There's podcasts, streaming services, sporting events, even the food order apps on our phone. A few taps from that app and the food will be delivered to our doorsteps in less time it takes to watch one episode of a show. That helps explain why food noise is not simply an individual experience. It exists in an environment specifically designed to keep food visible, accessible, and competing for our attention. There's a predictable outcome when an entire system becomes exceptionally skilled at driving consumption. Unfortunately, the outcome are rising rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and metabolic illnesses like high blood pressure. It didn't emerge by accident. And as those conditions become more common, then there's another industry that will profit from the consequences. The profitability of food and overconsumption created those health conditions. Obesity rates climbed, type 2 diabetes became more common, and all of those health dysfunctions were widespread. Of course, let me just say, no single food company caused these outcomes. There was no single factor. But human health is always more complicated than that. We have to think about genetics, stress, sleep, socioeconomic factors, and lifestyle. It all matters. When I look at my own family, I see all those influences at work. Heart disease and type 2 diabetes have affected generation after generation. It's one of the reasons I wanted to create this series in the first place. But it's also difficult to ignore the role of the environment, encouraging people to think about, purchase, and consume more food than at any point in human history that's going on right now. The pharmaceutical industry did not create food noise or hyperpalatable food, but it found itself in a position to treat many of the consequences associated with them. Medications for high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, weight loss, plus an ever-growing list of treatments. It's part of our health landscape, the modern health landscape. All these drugs, you see it on television, all these commercials. One of those weight loss medications are GLP-1s. This drug, though, the GLP-1s, they were originally developed for type 2 diabetes, but they quickly became part of a much larger conversation about weight, appetite, and food. What made them particularly interesting was not simply the effect on body weight, but their effect on our attention. People described that food noise, that quieting of food noise, that they were less preoccupied with food. They were less distracted by their cravings. If you do experience food noise, but you've never tried a GLP-1 medication, I like to tell you about my experience. For nearly 4 decades, it was like I was a sheep blindly following diet culture's herd mentality. I counted points. I logged calories in apps. I readied my restaurant menu order before I even stepped foot in the building. I clung to the hope that the next diet would finally unlock lasting health and happiness. And I tried to control my body and mind by controlling food. Sound familiar? Over time, though, points, calories, good and bad foods, they became a constant tug of war between, control and chaos. I told myself it was discipline, but really it was mental noise. I've been overweight a long time. The weight didn't come on from a hard year or a loss, right? It accumulated through seasons of stress, boredom, and that relentless chatter in my brain. I thought about food. I planned it. I avoided it. I negotiated with it. All of that noise, it built into a cacophony that never seemed to quiet. Just for years, it was my normal. That cycle defined me. But then I learned everything I've been telling you in the last 2 episodes. I had to look honestly at the ultra-processed foods I was eating. The poor sleep patterns I had. I was normalizing it. And then I also live with chronic inflammation. A lot of it was probably from the foods I ate. The real epiphany came when I understood that stress elevates cortisol, which is a hormone in your body. When it's elevated, the majority of the time, your cravings increase and you store fat. It's that whole fight or flight response. You need your energy. So everything you put in your mouth, your body holds on to. It stores it. And then I finally realized my body and my mind weren't broken. They were adaptive. Then a prescription of a GLP-1 entered my world. And that background chatter of food noise actually stopped. I felt like I won the lottery or I discovered a cure. If that sounds hyperbolic, trust me, when you've lived with constant food noise for decades, its silence feels miraculous. It feels spacious, calm. And for whatever this means, it felt normal to me. For once. It was a completely new experience to me. For me and for many people, the longer we stayed on the GLP-1s, the quieter the food noise got. The cravings didn't demand the attention they once did. They didn't go completely away. They weren't gone completely, but they were very, very quiet. Like I said, the negotiating, the planning, the guilt, it began to lose its grip on me. That grip felt like a chokehold I had lived with for decades. It was gone. I could breathe. I think it was life-changing. GLP-1s have improved health markers. They've reduced disease risk, and in some cases, even reduced interest in behaviors such as smoking, alcohol use, and even gambling. Researchers are still learning why this happens, but it appears these medications influence some of the same reward pathways involved in craving and anticipation. For many people, the result is a quieter relationship, not only with food, but the reward itself. The popularity of these medications has revealed that the conversation about obesity has never only been about weight. It's also about appetite, attention, reward, environment, and all the stories we tell ourselves about self-control. And perhaps the most interesting thing about the GLP medications, it's forced us to recognize that the nature of the problem itself. If millions of people have suddenly discovered that the noise got quieter, then maybe the question we should ask is, why was this noise so loud to begin with? For decades, the conversation about weight has revolved around, how do I lose it? Entire industries have been built around answering that question. Think about it. Diet books, fitness programs, apps, influencers, and even healthcare providers have focused on helping people reduce a number on the scale. Success is measured by pounds lost, calories counted, clothing sizes, and that before and after photo. I mean, there was an entire show dedicated to it, The Biggest Loser, where people would lose hundreds of pounds in, like a day. I'm kidding, but it was very quick. And I used to watch it, and I would, at the reveal at the end, how much weight they had lost, I would cry. That's a whole nother episode of why that emotion got me so much. But I think it's people that have this food noise, people that are overweight, we strive to find the solution, to find the answer of what goes on in our brain. Why can we not stop? I can't help wonder if we've been asking the wrong question or questions the entire time. What if the most important question isn't how much weight you want to lose? What if it's more meaningful than that? What if the question was, what kind of relationship do you want to have with food? Those aren't the same things. One focuses on an outcome while the other focuses on the experience. One is concerned about changing your body while the other is concerned with changing the way we live inside our bodies every day. When we talk about food noise, we rarely describe a desire to become obsessed with nutrition and calories or weight loss. What we describe is a feeling of carrying that extra mental burden. It's the realization that an extraordinary amount of attention has been devoted to food, to weight, dieting, and body image for years, for decades. For me, almost my entire life. That's what makes food noise such an important concept. I think it shifts the conversation away from weight and toward attention. The real cost of food noise is not simply what it may do to our waistline or our health markers, but to the mental space it occupies. Over time, that mental occupation becomes so familiar that we just stop noticing, even if it crowds out other things that matter. Family events, people talk about their reunions, like, oh, I have to lose all this weight. And then they don't lose weight and often don't go. Think about that. They missed out on an experience. I mean, I don't care about a high school reunion, but people do. Or a wedding or whatever. That could be an important milestone in their lives, and they may miss out because of that food noise. Many people whose food noise has quieted describe not simply eating less, but they realize they have more room. They are more focused on work, relationships, hobbies, goals. Basically experiences that have nothing to do with food. I feel much more present than I have been and felt in years. I think it's why this conversation matters. obviously now we know food noise isn't only about food, it's about our attention. And if you think about it, wherever our attention goes, a piece of our life goes with it. Basically, we become what we repeatedly attend to. I've learned that awareness rarely changes our lives in a single dramatic moment. More often, it changes the questions we ask. For years, many of us have approached food as the problem to solve. You search for the right diet, the right plan, the right amount of willpower. Always believing that if we could just find that missing piece, everything would fall into place. When I lose weight, I'm going to. When I lose weight, I will have the perfect, you fill in those blanks. But food noise, it definitely invites a different conversation. Again, instead of asking how to control food, we might begin by asking what role we want food to play in our lives. Instead of viewing every craving as a failure and every indulgence as a setback, we could become curious about the forces that influence those choices. Curiosity often takes us farther than criticism ever will. Once we recognize the systems, the environment, the habits and patterns shaping our relationships with food, we're no longer operating on autopilot. We can't control every influence around us, but we can begin making decisions with a clearer understanding of what we're responding to and why. You'll stop asking, what's wrong with me? You start asking better questions. Questions that are rooted in understanding and not in shame. That shift brings me back to where this series began. Before the points, the calories, the apps, the diets, the endless advice about what we should and shouldn't eat. Eating was much simpler. There was hunger, there was fullness, there was pleasure, there was nourishment. Over time, a lot of us stopped trusting those signals. Food became tangled up with stress, with comfort. Food is identity, right? Reward, expectations, and food rules. Somewhere along the way, eating has become so complicated. And that complication disconnects us from ourselves. What I hope you take from this episode and from this series so far, again, not a new set of rules. The world has so many rules around food. It lacks the understanding that many of the struggles we carry around food are, again, not signs of weakness, but our human responses to complex influences that most of us rarely stop to examine. Awareness is not going to solve every problem. It's not going to magically remove cravings, erase habits, or make healthy choices effortless. What it will do, it provides a perspective. Perspective helps us change the conversations we have with ourselves. In this podcast, I'm not promoting GLP-1s. That's your journey. Whether you want to take them or not, that's totally up to you. And I'm not trying to promote them. I'm just telling you what many have said about it and how I've experienced it, how I realized, became aware of this constant food noise and how it changed me, how I felt free. But that's all I'm saying about GLP-1s. Just know, if that's not your choice, that's not your choice. But now you're made aware of what food noise is. And if you are constantly occupied by it, maybe this episode can start to help you see the why of that. Remember, there was a version of you before the noise, before the rules, before food became something to negotiate with every single day. That version of you knew how to eat. It trusted hunger and recognized fullness. And that original self didn't spend cognitive energy bargaining with themselves over dinner. That person isn't gone. They just had a lot of noise layered over them. And understanding that, like really understanding not another rule, is how we find our way back to our original self. In the next episode, we're going to move from the outside in. If the system was built to hijack your appetite, what's it actually look like inside your brain? Episode 18 will look at the neuroscience of why you eat, and we'll take a deeper dive into dopamine, stress chemistry, and the real emotional grip that willpower has on us. That's up next on the Original Self podcast. Thank you for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to learn more about working with me, you'll find that information in the episode notes. But until next time, take good care of yourself.